Now I'll walk you through the majority of the steps in our process map. So step one is to determine if there is an option to stay in the current housing and to obtain funding and supports accordingly. So as you can see, the first question to ask is, does the person have the option to stay in their current housing? If no, then they should explore short-term crisis options. And footnote number 5, that little number next to it, tells us that there are resources for this in footnote number 5, below this flowchart. The option to stay in current housing, if yes, then the recommendation is to complete step 3 at the same time, while also trying to obtain funding to prevent homelessness. And so as you can see, there's a very small number there, number 1, which means that in the footnotes under this flowchart, footnote 1 will give us a list of resources for funding to prevent homelessness. Next step is to figure out their support needs. So if they require 24-hour care, then the suggestion is to look for funding to help them receive care at home. It's also suggested to obtain funding for housing. If they need no support, then the suggestion is to jump to step 2. After trying to find funding for in-home care and funding for housing, the next consideration is, do they need physical accessibility? Because if so, then in footnotes 3 and 4, we've provided resources for obtaining funding for assistive devices and home renovations. So as you can see, here's the first footnote, which is potential sources of funding for housing and housing-related costs. When you see a 2-column footnote section like this, keep in mind that you need to read them 1 column at a time, top down. So this column, we would start from here and we would read down into the next page, and then we would go back to the top of the second column and read down into the next page. So that's how you read these sections. In our first footnote, we have resources for preventing homelessness, and then we also have resources for those that are already experiencing homelessness. As you can see here in the blue font, we have resources that are specific to brain injury. And then we have resources for long-term care homes for those that require 24-hour medical care. So we also have a section for those with minimal to moderate support needs. The second footnote gives you potential sources of funding for in-home support or respite care. And once again, as you can see in the green font, that means that your first step is to contact the Toronto ABI network to get help and referrals with applying for these resources listed under it. Footnote 3 is for potential sources of funding for assistive technology and daily living aids. Footnote number 4 is potential sources of funding for accessible home modifications. Footnote number 5 is options for immediate crisis lodging. And as you can see at the beginning of some of them, there's details about who they're for. So these ones are just for men. Here you can see we have a few that are pet friendly as well. We have options for short-term housing. Now for step 2, the next step is to identify all potential sources of funding for income or disability. So the first question is to figure out if it's a workplace injury. And if yes, then we suggest applying for WSIB. We also ask everybody, was their brain injury caused by a motor vehicle accident? If yes, then apply for MVA insurance. And we also want to ask everybody, do they have any sort of disability insurance? Whether that's from personal insurance plans or from employment-related plans. And if they do have disability insurance, then the next step is to apply to redeem some of those benefits. Now, for everybody, they should be looking into government benefits that they can apply for. So you can see that's in footnote 3. And if it's relevant, then we recommend speaking to a personal injury lawyer about fully understanding their rights and the implications of their decisions. So that means risks as well. And then the next step is to apply for other types of funding, which are listed in footnote number 4. and then proceeding to step 3. So if we look at our footnote number 1, here is some information about contacting a personal injury lawyer. We've also included a list of qualified personal injury lawyers in Toronto here. The second footnote is about different types of disability insurance and government benefits, reimbursements, and rebates. And I should mention that there are employer-sponsored group insurance plans. There are private insurance plans that may have clauses for things like life insurance with disability riders. There could be health insurance clauses, extended plans for prescription drugs. We also have some business insurance plans that are specific to business owners. So it's important, if you have any type of insurance, personal or employer-based, to look into their policies closely to see if any of their clauses would cover your current situation. Now, there are also a long list of government benefits, reimbursements, and rebates in footnote 3. And in footnote 4, we have other potential sources of funding that are related to housing. We also have a list of options for current homeowners. Moving on to step 3, which is to develop and manage the relationship between the landlord and the tenant on an ongoing basis. We have some recommendations for how to communicate effectively with landlords and how to communicate effectively with clients, or in other words, the person with brain injury. And in this flowchart, you can see that the steps are broken up based on whether or not they have a landlord or if they own their own home. So the recommendation is, if they do have a landlord, then we want to help them negotiate with their landlord to try and stay in their current housing. And if they don't have a landlord and they don't own their home, so in other words, if they are insufficiently housed at this time, then we recommend completing steps 4 and 5 concurrently, and also negotiating with potential landlords to secure new housing. If housing is not retained or secured, then we want to repeat the steps of step 4 and 5 and negotiating with potential landlords. Once it is retained or secured, then we want to continually maintain a positive relationship with the landlords and mediate conflict as needed, before ultimately moving on to step 6. Now, as you can see from this flowchart, some of these steps can and should be done at the same time. That includes step 6, which can be done all throughout this entire process. I just want to point out that there's just one footnote for this step, and that is for resources to help you mediate landlord-tenant conflict. Step 4 is about planning and preparing the logistics for the housing search. So as you can see, there are things for you to take into consideration before you start looking for and choosing your housing options. So that includes understanding the client's needs and preferences, compiling all the documents they'll need for their application portfolio, preparing the budget, considering different areas and neighborhoods, considering distance and access to public transportation, to the services and the programs that they'll need to access, and managing the client expectations. And then step 3 and 5 should be done at the same time. And then we want to prepare them for landlord interviews, set up a rent payment structure, and then move to step 6. Once again, step 6 can be done at the same time throughout this entire process. So step 5 is where you actually start to search and apply for long-term housing options. If the person does not qualify for housing assistance, then they need to start looking at private rental options. And there are resources in footnotes 1, 2, and 3, and at the same time perform step 3. Once the housing is secured, then you can continue focusing on step 6. Now, if they do qualify for housing assistance, so that could be subsidized rent or rent geared to income, for example, then the next step is to figure out what their care needs are. So for example, if they need 24-hour care, then they'll need to search for supportive housing. And there are options listed in footnotes 1 and 3. If they need minimal to moderate support, then they'll need to look for housing with supports or safe housing. And then once the housing is secured, then we can focus more on step 6. If the housing is not secured, then they may have to consider applying for private rental options, as well as performing step 3 until housing is secured. Now, as we mentioned, there are very long wait times for the centralized wait list for subsidized housing in Toronto right now. So one option is to start looking for options outside of Toronto. So in footnote 1, you can see that there are some key search terms to help you find supportive housing options. And as you can see in the green font, the first step is to contact the ABI network for referrals and information about these blue font brain injury specific supportive housing options. Footnote 2 talks about key search areas to try to find safe housing, some of which are government supported, some of which are privately operated and owned. And some are other types of housing options. We even have some resources for if you're thinking about purchasing a home, and some non-traditional purchasing options. Now, this section we provide some resources on how to get informed so that you can avoid rental scams. We have safe housing options listed here, housing service navigation resources, hubs and application portals listed here. And we have just a handful of examples of funding and programs and housing that is available outside of Toronto. So that includes the GTA, Greater Toronto Area, and even some other cities within Ontario. So this is just to get you started with your search if you're looking outside of Toronto. So for example, it's broken up by funding for housing, transitional housing, emergency housing or shelters. Then we go back to the second column. We have supportive housing, safe housing, and housing service navigation resources. For step 6, which is our last step in our process map part, is to search for other local programs and supports that can increase income or offset the costs of basic necessities, other living costs, medical or therapy costs, so that the client or the individual will be able to allocate more funds toward housing. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, so please search for local services and programs that this individual might be eligible for. In the first footnote, we have details about how to access personal support workers to help them navigate all of these different applications. And then we have a list of types of community services programs and benefits that you might want to search for, with lots of different things to consider. And here, as you can see, if you reach out to the ABI network, they can help you get information or referrals for some of these brain injury specific programs. Now, one of the reasons we recommend doing step 6 all throughout the process is while they are trying to find housing, it's helpful to start getting them into some day programs and to start receiving some support in other areas of life. We also have a few resources for outside of the GTA here as well. We also have a few resources for support groups and programs for caregivers. So if you are a caregiver, please take care of yourself as well. And if you are a practitioner, please keep an eye out for the caregivers as well and support them in getting the help that they need and the resources that they need.